6 war dogs. 6 decorated veterans of classified missions nobody was supposed to know about. And in one single morning at Redstone Air Base, all 6 of them lost their minds. They tore through kennel walls, they drew blood from 3 handlers. The base commander signed the euthanasia order at 0900 hours, and nobody argued, because nobody had a better idea. Then Evelyn Carter walked through the gate carrying a canvas medical bag and a paper coffee cup, and every single dog went quiet. Not sedated, not restrained. Quiet. The kind of quiet that makes soldiers nervous, because only one kind of person produces it. And if you're the kind of person who stays until the credits roll, this is your story. Follow along, hit like, and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this one travels. Pay, the first dog, drew blood at 0612. Private Denny Rourke was 19 years old, had been working K-9 support for 4 months, and had been told by every senior handler on the base that the retired dogs in Kennel Block 7 were basically pets at this point. Gentle, tired, done. He found out different when Kodiak, a 10-year-old Belgian Malinois with a chest full of deployment citations and both hips slowly giving out, lunged through the gap in the enclosure gate and put his jaws around Rourke's forearm hard enough to bruise bone. Rourke didn't scream. That was the part people kept mentioning afterward, the part that made the incident feel worse than it should have. He just went down on one knee and held very still, which was either the bravest or the most terrified thing a person could do, and it turned out it didn't matter which. Kodiak didn't release until Sergeant Holloway fired a starter blank 6 feet away, and even then the dog just backed into the corner and stood there shaking, hackles up, eyes showing white. By 700, all 6 dogs in Block 7 were in crisis. Kodiak, Reaper, Dust, Vega, Six-Pack, May. 6 retired military working dogs, combined service record spanning 4 combat theaters across 11 years. Between them, they had located IEDs that saved God knows how many lives, tracked insurgents through mountain passes, protected handlers during firefights that never made it into any public report. They had been decorated. They had been celebrated. They had been, one by one, medically retired when their bodies started failing in the ways that military bodies eventually do. And now they were terrified. Had been terrified for weeks, actually. Anyone paying attention would have noticed. But Redstone Air Base outside Ashford, Colorado, had a staffing problem in the veterinary and handler units, and the administrator who signed off on kennel resource allocation was a man named Director Elliot Hargrove, who had spent exactly 0 time around working dogs and who had, over the preceding 6 months, quietly cut the behavioral health contract to save $11,000 from a budget line he didn't understand. $11,000. By 0800, the incident report was already 17 pages long. 3 handlers had been rotated out with bites or impact injuries, and the base had activated its emergency veterinary protocol, which meant doctor. Rosario Finch, the on-base vet, standing in front of Hargrove's desk and saying, in a voice she kept very deliberately flat, "I need behavioral support staff, I need the contract reinstated, and I need it today." Hargrove looked at her the way he looked at most things he found inconvenient. "We have the situation under control," he said. "We have 6 traumatized combat veterans in active crisis, and 1 19-year-old with a bruised radius," Finch said. "That is the opposite of under control. I've already contacted a specialist team out of Fort Ralston. They can be here by Thursday." "Thursday is 4 days from now, Director." "I'm aware of how calendars work, Doctor." Finch left his office before she said something she couldn't take back. She walked back across the cold morning air toward Block 7, where she could hear the dogs from 50 yards out, not barking, which would have been easier. They were vocalizing in that low, continuous register that meant sustained distress, the kind of sound that settled in your chest and sat there. She was standing outside the kennel door, rubbing her face, trying to figure out what she had left in her toolkit, when the duty officer called over. "Dr. Finch, there's a civilian at the east gate. Medical staff, temporary credentialed through the base hospital. She's asking to come in." Finch turned. "Asking to come in where?" "Here, ma'am." "She's asking to come in here." The civilian's name was Evelyn Carter. She was 31 years old, 5'6", wearing dark green scrubs under a fleece-lined jacket with a worn patch on the shoulder that might have once had text on it. She was carrying a canvas medical bag, the military surplus kind, not the nylon civilian version, and a paper coffee cup from the canteen 2 buildings over. Her hair was pulled back in a low knot. She looked, in the most complete sense of the word, unremarkable. Finch stepped toward the gate. "Can I help you?" "I heard about the situation from one of the ER nurses," Evelyn said. Her voice was easy, not nervous. "I've worked with traumatized K9s before. I thought I might be able to help." "You're from the base hospital." "Temporarily. I'm covering a maternity leave in the ER. I've been here 3 weeks." Finch studied her. "What's your background with working dogs?" Evelyn looked at the ground for a second, then back up. "Some field experience. I'd rather just show you than explain it." That should have been the end of the conversation. Finch had a protocol, and the protocol said you did not let uncredentialed civilians into an active animal emergency situation. She knew that. She also knew that her actual options right now were Thursday or this. She let her in. Master Sergeant Logan Pierce was inside the kennel corridor when they arrived. Pierce ran handler operations for Redstone's working dog program, or had, before the program got quietly defunded and repurposed, and the active unit shipped out and he got left behind to manage the retirees with a skeleton crew and a shrinking budget. He was 44, had the kind of face that had been weathered rather than aged, and he did not like surprises. "Who's this?" he said when Finch came through the door with Evelyn behind her. "She asked to come in. She has a background with K9s. Pierce looked at Evelyn the way combat veterans look at civilians who say they have backgrounds with things. Skeptical. Careful. Not hostile yet, but close. "What kind of background?" "Field," Evelyn said. "Field meaning what exactly? You train dogs for competition? Shelter work?" "Not exactly." Pierce's jaw tightened. He was in the middle of a crisis, and this woman was giving him half answers, and he did not have the patience for it. He turned to Finch. "I don't need civilians in here. I need—" One of the dogs, Vega, a German shepherd who'd lost 2/3 of her hearing in an explosion she'd survived while her handler hadn't, hit the kennel wall hard enough to rattle the entire structure. Everyone startled, except Evelyn. She turned toward the sound without flinching. She set her coffee cup on the nearest flat surface. She unzipped her canvas bag slowly, deliberately, pulled out nothing, just made the motion, the opening gesture, let the familiar smell of whatever was inside the bag move through the air. And then she straightened up and walked toward Vega's kennel at a pace that was not slow and not fast, but something in between that had a quality to it Pierce couldn't immediately name. She stopped 3 feet from the kennel door. Her hands were at her sides. She didn't say anything for a long moment, then quietly, "Hey girl, I've got you." Vega stopped hitting the wall. It wasn't immediate. She paced, circled, made a sound low in her throat. But within 90 seconds, she had dropped to the floor and put her head on her paws. Still watching, still tense, but no longer slamming herself against concrete. Pierce stood very still. Down the corridor, Reaper, a Malinois who had been pacing in tight, frantic circles for 2 hours straight, stopped pacing. He sat. He put his nose up and scented the air, and then he sat some more. "How did you do that?" Pierce said. His voice was quieter than he intended. "She's deaf," Evelyn said. "She's not responding to sound cues. She's responding to body language and scent. She's scared because everything around her is chaotic, and she can't hear well enough to understand what's happening, and nobody has been presenting a calm physical signal." She paused. "She needs stillness, not volume." Pierce looked at the dog, then at Evelyn. "Finch?" he said. "Yeah," Finch said. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Director Hargrove arrived at Block 7 at 0930, and he arrived the way Hargrove arrived everywhere, like he was delivering news rather than receiving it. He was 56, trim, with the kind of administrative posture that comes from decades of meetings, and he had been told by his aide that the situation was stabilizing, which he had interpreted to mean it had been handled. He walked in and found a civilian woman sitting cross-legged on the floor outside Kodiak's enclosure. The old Malinois pressed against the other side of the chain link, nose through the gap, breathing slow. Hargrove stared at this for 3 full seconds. "Who is that?" Pierce, standing to the right, said, Temporary ER staff. She's been helping manage the behavioral crisis. She's sitting on the floor. Yes, sir. In my kennel facility. Yes, sir. Hargrove walked forward. His voice shifted to the register he used when he wanted to make clear that someone was an inconvenience. Excuse me. Miss Carter? Evelyn said without looking up. Miss Carter, I appreciate whatever it is you think you're doing here, but this is a military installation and these animals are under the care of our veterinary staff. You need to go back to where you came from. Evelyn looked up at him then. Her face was neutral, not angry, not apologetic, just present. These dogs are in acute psychological distress. 3 of them haven't eaten in 48 hours. Kodiak's been guarding that back wall for 2 days, which means he's identified a threat queue that nobody's addressed yet. If you remove me now, you're going to have a much harder morning than you're already having. Hargrove's expression did something complicated. He was not used to being addressed this way by someone who worked in his hospital system, especially not someone in scrubs sitting on a concrete floor. 48 hours, Pierce said suddenly from the side. She's right. I put it in the incident log. Hargrove, they haven't... I didn't ask for your input, Master Sergeant. No, sir. I'm offering it anyway. The room got tight. Pierce had been offering his input without being asked for most of the 6 months since the budget cuts, and Hargrove's patience for it had run completely dry. He turned back to Evelyn. You have no credentials for this work, Miss Carter. You are a temporary ER nurse. I'm going to ask you to gather your things. I have credentials, Evelyn said. Quiet. Brief. Excuse me? I said I have credentials. I just haven't offered them because it's not relevant to what I'm doing right now. She stood up, unhurried, no drama, and looked at him levelly. You can ask me to leave. That's your call. But I'd suggest you wait until the end of the day and see what the situation looks like. Hargrove stared at her. Then he looked at Pierce, then at Finch, who had the expression of someone who is actively trying not to say anything. Get her out of here, he said to Pierce. Politely. He turned and left. Pierce stood there for a long moment after the door closed. He looked at Evelyn. She had already turned back toward Kodiak's enclosure. You heard him? Pierce said. I heard him, she agreed. I need you to go. She looked at Kodiak. The old dog's breathing had slowed to something close to normal over the past hour. His eyes were still watchful, but the white-rimmed terror was gone. Yeah, she said. Okay. She picked up her canvas bag. She picked up her coffee cup, which had gone cold. She walked toward the door. Pierce watched her go. Something was sitting in his chest that he couldn't quite locate. He'd been in enough situations to recognize the feeling. The feeling you get when someone leaves a room and you're not certain the room is better for it. He almost said something. He didn't. She was through the gate and 20 yards down the base road when it happened. The sound from Block 7 was different this time. Not the low, sustained distress tone, but something sharper, more directional. Pierce's radio crackled. Master Sergeant, we have a containment breach. Six-Pack is out. Repeat. Six-Pack is... Six-Pack was an 8-year-old black German shepherd who had spent 6 years on patrol in environments where everything that moved at night was a potential threat. His retirement had been prompted not by injury, but by what the behavioral assessment diplomatically called elevated reactivity in non-operational contexts. In plain language, he startled badly, and when he startled, he moved toward the threat. He was out. He was in the corridor, and 3 handlers were backed against the far wall, none of them making eye contact, none of them doing anything wrong, but their bodies broadcasting exactly the kind of anxious, braced tension that a dog like Six-Pack read as danger. Pierce hit the door at a run and came in to find Six-Pack in the center of the corridor, hackles full, doing the low, barrel-chested thing that meant the situation was about 12 seconds from going very badly. He reached for his radio to call the emergency vet protocol. Stopped. Behind him, the door opened. He didn't turn around. He knew who it was. He heard her footsteps. Measured, unhurried, the walk with that specific quality she had that he still couldn't name. And then Evelyn Carter stepped past him into the corridor. She held nothing in her hands. She didn't raise them. She didn't crouch down or make herself small or do any of the things you'd do if you'd learned this from a shelter training video. She walked into Six-Pack's space at that same measured pace, put herself between him and the backed-against-the-wall handlers and let him look at her. Six-Pack's hackles stayed up. His head was low. He was doing the assessment thing, reading her, reading everything. She said nothing for a full 8 seconds. Pierce counted. Then she spoke one word. Not a command, not a cue, something in a register so low Pierce wasn't entirely sure he'd heard it correctly. She said, "Easy." Six-Pack's hackles dropped by half. She took one step closer. They dropped the rest of the way. He sat. It was not a trained response to a command. Pierce had been around dogs his whole career, and he knew the difference between a dog that obeyed and a dog that trusted, and what he was watching was the second thing. Six-Pack was looking at Evelyn the way dogs look at the one person in the room they've decided is safe, and his whole body had reorganized itself around that decision. The 3 handlers against the wall hadn't moved. Evelyn crouched down, finally, slowly, and Six-Pack pushed his head against her knee. The corridor was absolutely silent. Pierce's radio crackled again. He turned it off. He found her 20 minutes later when the situation was fully contained and Six-Pack was back in his kennel and Dr. Finch was doing a check on the rest of the dogs. Evelyn was outside, sitting on the concrete step of the facility entrance, holding her cold coffee with both hands. Pierce sat down on the step beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment, then, "What you did in there?" "Yeah. That's not something you learn in a nursing program." She drank the last of her cold coffee. "No. And it's not something you pick up volunteering at the pound on weekends." "No." He looked at the side of her face. She was looking straight ahead at the parking lot, at the mountain range visible above the tree line, at nothing particular. "You were military," he said. She didn't answer right away. When she did, it was carefully. "I was adjacent to military." "Adjacent? Some things I can talk about. Some things I can't. Can you tell me when you last worked with K9 units?" She thought about it. 7 years ago, give or take." "In what capacity?" "Medical support?" A pause. "In contexts that don't have official records." Pierce had spent 22 years in the Army. He knew what that meant. He knew the specific shape of that sentence, the careful phrasing of it, the deliberate vagueness, because he'd used it himself, describing work he'd done in places that didn't officially exist. He was quiet for a long moment. "Hargrove's going to pull your access," he finally said. "I know." He already called the hospital administrator. "They're reviewing your temporary credentials." She nodded, not surprised. "Whatever you did, wherever you did it." He stopped, started again. "Those dogs, Carter, they haven't responded to anyone in weeks. Not to me, not to the handlers, not to Finch. Six-Pack broke containment 3 days ago, and it took 4 people to get him back in his kennel, and nobody got hurt by pure luck." His voice had something in it now, something that sat at the edge of his professional register. "You walked in, and you fixed it in 4 hours. Evelyn looked down at her empty coffee cup. "I didn't fix it," she said. "I started it. Those dogs still need weeks of consistent work. They need handlers who approach them the right way, a routine that doesn't reinforce the hypervigilance, probably some environmental changes in the kennel layout." She paused. "The fix is the work you do after I'm gone." Pierce stared at her. "After I'm gone," he repeated. She looked at him then. Just for a second. There was something in her face, not sadness exactly, but the kind of matter-of-fact acceptance that belongs to people who have been in enough situations to know that things resolve in messy, imperfect ways, and that being right doesn't automatically mean you get to stay in the room. "Hargrove called it," she said. "That's his prerogative. His prerogative is destroying this program." "That might be true," she said, "but it's still his prerogative." She stood up, shouldered her canvas bag, and was halfway down the path when Pierce's radio crackled back on. The voice on the other end belonged to Corporal Dana Wills, the youngest handler on the unit, who had been with Block 7 for 8 months and who Pierce knew to be composed under most forms of pressure. She was not composed now. "Master Sergeant," a breath, another. "You need to come back inside." "Wills, It's Dust." Pierce was already moving. Dust was the dog none of the incident reports quite captured correctly. The other 5 had been showing distress for weeks, which was bad enough. But Dust was a 9-year-old Belgian Malinois who had spent 4 years on classified close protection details, who had been retired not for physical decline, but because his last handler had died in a non-combat accident 18 months ago, and who had not, since then, allowed anyone within arm's reach. He didn't attack. He retreated. He pressed himself into the far back corner of his kennel, and he stayed there, not eating, not responding, not doing anything that the veterinary team could categorize as either aggressive or safe. Just existing at minimum functional capacity, the way a thing exists when it's waiting to stop. Finch had been writing up a euthanasia consultation for Dust for 3 weeks. Not because he was dangerous, because she didn't know what else to do for him, and watching a dog wait to die was its own kind of cruelty. Pierce came through the kennel door and stopped. Dust was out of his corner. He was standing in the center of his enclosure, and Evelyn Carter was on the other side of the chain link, on her knees on the concrete, one hand flat against the fence. Dust had his nose pressed against her palm. Pierce hadn't seen that dog make voluntary contact with a human being in 7 months. He stood in the doorway and did not move because moving felt like it might break something. Wills appeared at his elbow. She was 23 years old and she had been handling dogs for 2 years, and she had clearly been crying, which she was clearly hoping he wouldn't notice. She was leaving, Wills said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was gone, and then she turned around and she came back in and she went straight to his kennel, like she knew. Pierce watched Evelyn's hand against the fence, watched Dust's nose against her palm. Like she knew, he said. His radio crackled. Hargrove's aide. Access credentials revoked as of 1100 hours. Miss Carter to be escorted from the facility. Pierce looked at his watch. It was 10:43. He put the radio back on his belt without responding. He had 17 minutes, and he was going to use every one of them figuring out exactly who Evelyn Carter was, because the woman kneeling on his kennel floor, reaching through chain link to a dog that had given up on being reached, was not a temporary ER nurse. She had never been just a temporary ER nurse, and whatever she was hiding in those careful clipped answers, he was going to find it. He had 17 minutes, and he spent the first 4 of them standing in the kennel corridor doing something he almost never did. Nothing. Pierce was not a man who wasted time on deliberation. 22 years in the Army had given him the ability to make decisions fast and live with them, and the decisions he'd made in the last hour had all felt right in the moment, and now felt complicated in ways he couldn't fully articulate. He'd let Evelyn in against protocol. He'd watched her do things he didn't have a framework for. He'd stood with his radio off while Hargrove's aide waited for a response, and now she was kneeling on his kennel floor with her hand through the fence, and Dust, 9-year-old Dust, the dog Finch had quietly started building a euthanasia case for, had his nose pressed against her palm like he was remembering something. Pierce pulled out his phone and called Lieutenant Ethan Brooks. Brooks was 28, ran base administration support, and was the kind of officer who could find information quickly and ask questions about it later. Pierce had relied on that quality before. "I need you to run a name," Pierce said when Brooks picked up. "Now?" "Now. Evelyn Carter, civilian, temporary ER staff, been here 3 weeks. Start with military records. Any service branch." A pause on the line. "Master Sergeant, civilian records require—" "I know what they require, Brooks. Start with what you can access and tell me what you find." He hung up and went to talk to Evelyn. She was still at the fence when he got back to her. Dust had retreated a foot but hadn't gone back to his corner, which Pierce understood, in the language of a dog like that, to be enormous. He crouched down beside her, not at the fence, just near it. "They pulled your access," he said. "I heard the radio. You've got about 12 minutes before someone comes to walk you out." She didn't argue, didn't look surprised, just kept her attention on Dust. "His breathing's better than it was an hour ago." "Carter?" "Yeah." "I need you to tell me something real." She turned her head and looked at him. Her eyes were brown and tired and not unfriendly, but there was something behind them, a kind of practiced distance, like someone who had learned a long time ago not to put everything on the surface. "What do you want to know?" she said. "Whatever you're willing to say." She looked back at Dust. The dog had lowered himself onto his front legs, still watching her, still close. "I was a combat nurse," she said. That part's true. I served with units that operated in places that don't appear in standard deployment records. The work I did with the K9 units was part of that. When a dog got hurt in the field, I was there. When a handler got hurt and the dog needed management, I was there. A pause. When the mission required someone who could move through a space without alarming the dogs, because dogs don't lie, and they'll alert if they sense something wrong with the person near them, I was used for that too. Pierce was very quiet. That last part, he said, that's not combat nursing. No, she agreed. It's not. What branch? She almost smiled. Almost. The kind that doesn't answer that question. His radio crackled. Hargrove's aide again, more insistent this time, asking for confirmation that the civilian was being escorted out. Pierce stood, keyed his radio, said, "Copy, in progress," and looked down at Evelyn. "Finish with dust," he said, low enough that his voice didn't carry. "Take the time you need. I'll manage the escort." She looked up at him. Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not gratitude exactly, but recognition. The kind you exchange with someone who operates from the same basic code, even when everything around them is running differently. She turned back to the fence. Pierce walked back down the corridor to buy her the time she had left. Hargrove was in the facility entrance when Pierce got there, which meant the 12 minutes had become 5. He was standing with his arms crossed and the expression he used when he was certain he was right about something. "Master Sergeant, is the situation resolved?" "The dogs are calm, sir. Dr. Finch has eyes on all 6. "And the civilian?" "Finishing up." Hargrove's jaw tightened. "I said—" "She's finishing up, Director. 4 minutes." Pierce kept his voice level, professional, the voice of a man who was not picking a fight. "After what happened this morning, pulling her out mid-contact with dust is a risk I'd rather not take." Hargrove looked at him for a long moment, then, 4 minutes. Pierce nodded and went back. Evelyn was already standing when he got there. Dust was at the fence, actually at it, pressed against the chain link, watching her prepare to leave in a way that Pierce found unexpectedly hard to observe. Corporal Wills was nearby, pretending to check something on her clipboard. "He's going to regress," Wills said without looking up. Her voice was careful and controlled, which meant she was managing something. "Not if you approach him the way I showed you," Evelyn said. She slung her canvas bag over one shoulder. "Low, slow, don't reach. Let him come to you first every time, even if it takes 20 minutes. Don't rush it because you're worried about him." She paused. "He knows when you're worried about him, and he reads it as confirmation that there's something to worry about." Wills wrote something on the clipboard she wasn't actually reading. "Okay," Wills said. "You'll do fine." "What if he goes back to the corner?" "Then he goes back to the corner," Evelyn said. "And you sit outside the fence for a while and you don't ask anything from him. That's not failure. That's trust building." Wills nodded, quick, once, like if she did it fast enough, it wouldn't count as the emotional response it was. Pierce walked Evelyn out through the facility entrance, past Hargrove, who said nothing, just tracked her with the kind of attention that meant he wasn't done with this situation. At the base road, Evelyn stopped. "Thank you," she said to Pierce, "for the time." "Don't thank me. I was buying time for the dogs." "Sure," she said, and there was that almost smile again. "That's definitely why." She walked toward the hospital building. Pierce watched her go. The morning light was flat and gray, and the mountains to the west had clouds building along the ridgeline, the kind that usually meant weather by afternoon. He stood there for a moment, then went back inside to deal with what was left. Brooks called back at 11:30. "I found almost nothing," he said, and he said it in a particular way, not like someone who ran a search and came up empty, but like someone who ran a search and found a shape where records should be. "There's a service number. Army. Separation date 8 years ago. Medical Corps designation, but the deployment records are... They're redacted, Master Sergeant. Not missing. Redacted. With a classification code I've only seen twice before." Pierce leaned against the wall outside his office. "What code?" Brooks named it. Pierce recognized it. "You didn't forget a classification code like that once you'd seen it, because you only saw it on files that had been touched by a specific tier of operation. The kind of work that happened in the space between official policy and operational necessity. That's all, Pierce said. There's one more thing. There's a commendation citation. Most of the text is blacked out, but the header is intact. A pause. It's a Joint Meritorious Unit Award. The issuing command is listed as... Brooks stopped. Master Sergeant, the issuing command doesn't exist. The unit designation is a number code. I ran it 3 times. Pierce said nothing for a moment. Then, don't file any of this. Don't mention it to anyone on the administrative side. Understood. He hung up. He stood in the corridor outside his office for a while, looking at nothing, turning the information over. A civilian ER nurse with a classified service record, a blacked-out commendation, and a skill set that made 6 traumatized combat veterans drop into trust within 4 hours. He'd spent 22 years building context for situations, and the context he had for Evelyn Carter was accumulating in a way that made him feel, for the first time in months, like the ground he was standing on might be more complicated than the base had let him believe. He went to find Finch. Dr. Rosario Finch was not having a good day, which was not unusual for a veterinarian working a facility that had been systematically stripped of resources for 6 months. But today was particularly bad because the morning's events had produced a mountain of paperwork that she was now sitting inside while her actual work, the 6 dogs who needed actual medical and behavioral attention, waited. She looked up when Pierce came through her office door and did not look pleased. "I need 5 minutes," he said. "I need 5 days," she said. "What?" "Evelyn Carter." Finch put down her pen. "What about her? What do you know about her? How she ended up here?" "Same as what I told you this morning. She heard about the situation from ER staff. She came and asked. I let her in." A pause. "I know how that looks in terms of protocol, and I will sign whatever incident report Hargrove needs me to sign, but I want it noted that the alternative at the time was to wait until Thursday and watch 3 more handlers get hurt." "I'm not here about the protocol," Pierce said. "I'm here because her records have a classification code that means she wasn't just a combat nurse." Finch was quiet for a moment. "What kind of not just?" "The kind that explains why 6 dogs who haven't responded to anyone in weeks responded to her in under 4 hours." Finch looked at her desk. She picked up her pen, put it down again. "She asked me before she left. She asked me about Dust specifically. Whether the euthanasia recommendation was final." "What did you say?" "I said it wasn't final. That I'd been building the case because I didn't have other options." She paused. She looked at me for a second, and then she said, "He's not ready to give up. He's just waiting for someone to stay." And then she left. Pierce sat in the chair across from her desk, which he didn't usually do. "She's gone," he said. Hargrove pulled her credentials. "I know. The dogs are going to need consistent follow-through on what she started. The approach she was using with each of them was different. She was reading them individually, not running a standard protocol. Wills is trying, but she's 23 and she's been doing this for 8 months, and she doesn't have the..." "Pierce." Finch's voice was quiet but firm. "I know. I was there." He stopped. "I know," she said again. "And I don't know what to do about it any more than you do, because the woman who could actually fix this just got walked out of our facility because Hargrove wants his paperwork clean." Her voice had a controlled edge to it. "So tell me what you're planning, because I can see on your face that you're planning something, and I'd like to know if I'm about to have more paperwork or less." Pierce looked at her. She looked back. She had the expression of someone who was tired and capable and willing, all 3 at once. "Let me find out what I can first," he said. "Fine." She picked up her pen. "Close the door on your way out." He spent the next 2 hours doing what he was good at, which was moving through a system carefully and extracting information without triggering it. He made 3 phone calls that he did not log. He asked 2 questions to 2 different people who had no reason to talk to each other and got answers that, separately, meant nothing, but together drew a shape he recognized. Evelyn Carter had served with the K9 Integrated Operations Unit under a task force that had been officially disbanded 7 years ago. The disbanding was real. The records were sealed. The unit had operated in 4 countries over 6 years, and the work they did, The specific, careful, necessary work of keeping both the animals and the operators functional in environments that broke both had been accomplished by a small medical team that was, by all official accounts, not there. She had never been decorated publicly. She had never been listed in any deployment roster that he could access. The commendation Brooks had found was, as far as Pierce could determine, the only trace of her that the administrative record had failed to fully erase. He was sitting with this at his desk, trying to figure out what to do with it, when Corporal Wills appeared in his doorway. Her face was the wrong color. "Master Sergeant," she said, "you need to come to Block 7. He was up before she finished the sentence. He got to the kennel corridor to find Finch already there, crouched beside the enclosure of Kodiak. The first dog. The dog who'd started all of it that morning. Kodiak was on his side. His breathing was labored. His eyes were partially open. "What happened?" Pierce said. "He's crashing," Finch said, and her voice was the clinical voice she used when she needed her fear not to be in the room. "Heart. Probably been building for weeks. The stress of this morning..." She stopped. "I need to make a call. He might need intervention that I don't have the equipment for here." Pierce looked at the dog. Kodiak. 10 years old. 4 combat deployments. The dog that had started this whole morning by putting his jaws around a 19-year-old's arm out of pure terrified confusion, because nobody had been paying attention to what he needed for long enough that he'd broken. He pulled out his phone and called Evelyn Carter. She picked up on the second ring. "Kodiak," he said. "He's crashing. Cardiac. Finch says she might not have what she needs." A half-second pause. "I'm 7 minutes out. Tell Finch to keep him warm and don't let him up. Stress position will make it worse." "You're not credentialed on this base anymore." "I know," she said. "I'm coming anyway." She was there in 6. Hargrove was going to have something to say about it. Pierce knew that. He also knew that whatever Hargrove had to say was going to have to wait, because there was a 10-year-old decorated combat veteran lying on a kennel floor, and the one person who had any hope of changing what happened next was coming through the gate. He met her at the entrance. She wasn't carrying her canvas bag this time. She was carrying a hard-sided case, the kind used for emergency veterinary field kits, and she moved with a different quality than she had that morning. Faster, more deliberate, the ease stripped away, and something else in its place, something that reminded Pierce of watching operators move when they'd just received a contact report. "Where?" she said. "This way." They went. Behind them, Pierce's radio crackled. Hargrove's aide, for the 3rd time today, asking for his location. He left the radio on his belt without answering. Whatever was about to happen in that kennel corridor was going to reshape the next several days in ways he couldn't predict. And at the center of it was a woman who'd been escorted off this base 2 hours ago and had just walked back onto it, carrying equipment she wasn't supposed to have and knowledge she'd never been allowed to claim. And the part that Pierce kept coming back to, the part that sat in his chest as he walked her toward Block 7, was that Evelyn Carter had not hesitated for a single second when he'd called. She hadn't asked if it was safe for her to come back. She hadn't mentioned what Hargrove would say. She hadn't weighed the risk to herself against the risk to the dog. She'd said she was 7 minutes out, and she'd been there in 6. And now Hargrove's aide was on the radio again, and the base security log was going to show her re-entry on revoked credentials, and there was going to be a conversation that Pierce was not looking forward to. But all of that was on the other side of whatever was happening in the next hour, and Evelyn Carter was already pushing through the kennel door ahead of him with her hard-sided case and dropping to her knees beside Kodiak before Finch had finished clearing the space. The old dog opened his eyes when she touched him. His tail moved, once, barely. "Hey," she said quietly. "I've got you." And she went to work. Finch had worked on animals in crisis for 11 years, and she knew, the way you know things after 11 years, when a situation was outside her lane. This was outside her lane. Kodiak's heart rate was erratic. She could feel it in the pulse at his femoral, irregular, and too fast, and occasionally dropping into a pause that made her count, involuntarily, the seconds until the next beat. She had a portable monitor, but it was the kind of equipment that told you things were bad without telling you what to do about them. And what she had in her kit for cardiac intervention was limited by the reality that Block 7 was a retirement kennel, not a surgical unit, and nobody had budgeted for cardiac events in aging working dogs, because nobody had wanted to have that conversation. Evelyn opened her hard-sided case without looking at what was in it, the way people who have packed the same kit many times open it, by feel, by order, by a system built into muscle memory. "What's his history?" she said to Finch, not looking up. "Hip dysplasia, managed. Some hearing loss in the right ear. Cardiac workup 8 months ago showed early-stage arrhythmia. We adjusted his activity level. He was stable." Finch paused. "The stress load from the last 6 weeks probably—" "Yeah," Evelyn said. She had her fingers at Kodiak's neck, counting. "It probably did." She pulled a syringe from the case, checked it, set it on the floor beside her. Then another. Her movements were precise and completely without performance. She was not working for an audience. She was just working. "His gums," Finch checked. "Pale, not white." "Okay, that's okay." Evelyn glanced up at Pierce, who was standing at the enclosure doorway. "I need someone outside this space who isn't anxious. Right now, you're both broadcasting. Finch stays, you go." Pierce's jaw tightened slightly. He went. He understood the logic, even if it grated. A dog in cardiac distress reading the emotional state of every person in the room, reading it more accurately than those people could read each other, was not a variable you could argue with. He stepped back into the corridor and stood there with Corporal Wills, who was doing the thing she'd been doing all day, which was managing herself very carefully in public. "She knows what she's doing," Wills said. She said it like she was trying to convince herself and had almost succeeded. "Yeah," Pierce said. He put his hand on the wall and listened to Finch reading vitals in a low, steady voice, and Evelyn asking single short questions and getting single short answers, and the sounds that Kodiak was making. Slower now, less distressed, or at least different. His phone buzzed. Brooks. He stepped further down the corridor and answered. "Master Sergeant, I have a problem," Brooks said. He sounded like he'd been on the phone with people who outranked him. "Hargrove's been making calls. He's flagging Carter's re-entry as a security violation, and he's asking for a formal review of the morning's events. He wants documentation on everyone who gave her access." "When?" "He wants a preliminary report by 1700 today." Pierce checked his watch. 13:27. "Tell him I'll have it." "There's more." Brooks paused in the way he paused when he was delivering something he'd rather not. He called the hospital administrator, Dr. Walcott. He's asking for Carter's employment records, her credentials file, her full background submission. He wants to know how she got temporary credentialing in the first place. Did Walcott comply? "I don't know yet." Pierce leaned against the wall. "Keep me updated." He hung up and stood there for a moment. The situation was organizing itself into a shape he recognized, the shape of an administrator who felt his authority had been publicly undermined and was now moving to reassert it through documentation and formal process, which was both predictable and, in this specific context, dangerous. Because a formal review of this morning was also a formal review of what had been happening to Block 7 for 6 months. The staffing cuts, the behavioral contract, the vet protocol gap, the incident log that Hargrove had signed off on without reading properly. Pierce had not gotten to 22 years in the Army by walking into avoidable situations without a plan. He pushed off the wall and went back to Block 7. Kodiak was breathing steadier by 1400, not fixed. Finch was clear about that, and she was the kind of doctor who didn't soften bad news into shapes that felt better in the moment. He needs an actual cardiac workup at a facility with imaging equipment. What Evelyn did stabilized him, but he's got underlying pathology that isn't going away. She said this to Pierce while Evelyn was still on the floor, one hand resting on Kodiak's flank, not moving, just present. If this had happened at night, on the overnight rotation, with the handler staff we currently have, "I know," Pierce said. "He would have died," Finch said. "Just straight, no inflection." "I know." Finch looked at Evelyn. "She had the right medication. She had it in the case. That's not ER nursing equipment, Pierce. That's a field kit, a specific field kit." "I know that too." "I'm not saying anything about it," Finch said. "I'm noting it, for my own understanding." Pierce nodded. He walked to the enclosure and crouched down at the entrance. Evelyn was watching Kodiak's chest rise and fall. The dog had his eyes open, tired and old, but open. "Thank you," Pierce said. She didn't look at him. "Don't thank me yet. He needs to get to a proper facility in the next 24 hours. "I'm working on it." "Hargrove's going to make that hard." "He's going to try," Pierce said. "There's a difference." She looked at him then, a long, assessing look. "What are you planning?" she said. Same thing I asked Finch when she said the same thing to me. "Let me find out what I can first." Something moved across her face. Almost amusement. Almost. "That's what you said to her?" "It's a useful answer." She looked back at Kodiak. "You have until 1700. "I know. Because after 1700, he's going to have a formal document with my name on it. And once that exists—" "I know," Pierce said a third time. And this time he said it with the kind of weight that meant he was not dismissing the concern, but actively carrying it. "I'm not going to let that happen." She looked at him again. He was not certain she believed him. He wasn't entirely certain he believed himself. But he was certain that he was not going to sit in his office and let Elliot Hargrove dismantle the one situation he'd managed to hold together by replacing the behavioral contract with $11,000 worth of administrative convenience. He stood and went to make calls. The first call was to Colonel Diana Voss at Fort Ralston. Voss ran the military working dog program oversight for their region, and Pierce had worked with her twice before, once 3 years ago on a handler training review, once on a transport logistics problem that had required someone with enough rank to cut through paperwork fast. She was efficient, unsentimental, and had strong opinions about institutional negligence, which made her exactly the right person. She picked up on the third ring. "Pierce, what do you need?" He told her the outline. Block 7, the behavioral contract cut, the 6 dogs, the crisis, the morning. He kept it short and factual, the way she preferred. Silence on the line when he finished. Then, "Who authorized the contract termination?" "Director Hargrove, Administrative Authority, Budget Reallocation." "Does Hargrove have any background in working dog management?" "No, ma'am." "Does he have background in military animal welfare protocol?" "Not that I can find." Another silence. "I'm going to need a written summary, Pierce. Incident log, medical reports, the vet's assessment. Can you have that to me by end of day?" 1700 is tight. "Make it 1800. I'll be working late." A pause. "The civilian, the one your Hargrove is flagging." "Carter," Pierce said. "She's not just a nurse." It wasn't a question. Pierce thought about how to answer it. "Her record is classified," he said, "above my access level. But she stabilized a cardiac event in an aging Malinois with a field kit that she brought herself." "Yes, ma'am." "And before that, she walked 6 dogs in active behavioral crisis down from the ceiling in under 4 hours." "That's accurate." Voss made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. "Get me the documents, Master Sergeant. I'll handle my end." He hung up and felt for the first time since 0612 that morning like the geometry of the situation was shifting. Preswell, Hargrove called at 14:45. Pierce was at his desk building the document package for Voss when his desk phone rang, and he knew from the extension that it was Hargrove's office, and he answered it anyway because not answering it was a different kind of problem. "Master Sergeant," Hargrove's voice had the quality of controlled anger, the kind that presents as professional and isn't. "I want to understand something. I was informed that the Carter woman re-entered this facility after her credentials were revoked." "Yes, sir." "On your authorization?" "On my operational judgment, sir. We had a medical emergency with one of the animals. She had field experience that the situation required." "She had revoked credentials and an unauthorized hard case of veterinary pharmaceuticals," Hargrove said. "That is a base security issue, a liability issue, and a direct violation of the instructions I gave you at 1100 hours." "Understood, sir." "Is that all you have to say?" Pierce thought about it. "I'll have the incident documentation to you by 1700, sir. Full timeline, full account." A pause. "Good. I also want to be clear that the civilian is not to return to this facility under any circumstances. If she appears at any gate, security is to be notified immediately." "Yes, sir." "And Pierce," the voice shifted, lower, less administrative. I don't know what you think you're managing here, but this base runs on chain of command, not on individual judgment calls made by NCOs who've decided they know better. Pierce held the phone and said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was very even. I'll have the documentation to you by 1700, Director. He put the phone down. He sat for 30 seconds, staring at the middle distance. Then he went back to building the package for Voss and added 3 items he hadn't originally planned to include: the behavioral contract termination memo, the timeline of incident escalations over the 6 preceding weeks, and the original vet recommendation that Hargrove had received, noted, and filed without action. He was not choosing a fight. He was choosing a record. At 15:30, Evelyn found him. She appeared in his doorway without announcement, which meant she was still on the base, which meant security hadn't physically removed her yet, probably because Hargrove's instruction had gone to the gate staff but not been relayed clearly to the interior, and in the gap between those 2 administrative steps she had simply stayed. Pierce looked at her. You're still here. Kodiak needs someone with him for the next few hours. Wills is there, but... She stopped. I didn't want to leave until his color was better. Hargrove's going to find out. He's going to find out anyway. She sat down in the chair across from his desk without being invited. She looked tired in a way she hadn't that morning. The focused energy from earlier had settled into something more honest. Can I ask you something? You can ask. The dogs. Before the contract got cut, what was the plan for them? The 6 in Block 7, long term. Pierce leaned back. Retirement in place. Handlers manage them, vet does routine checks. They live out their time on the base. Standard protocol for combat retirees. And after the cuts? Same plan, less support. Less support, she repeated. She said it without judgment, which somehow made it worse. Kodiak should have had a cardiac consult 4 months ago. Dust's behavioral decline was documented in the log in March. Sixpack's containment breach this morning was the 3rd one this quarter. She looked at her hands. Someone was reading those logs and not acting on them. I know. That's not a staffing problem, she said. That's a decision. Pierce was quiet. I'm not telling you something you don't know, Evelyn said. No, he said. You're not. She looked at him directly. What's in the package you're building? He glanced at his screen. How do you know I'm building a package? Because you've been in here for an hour, and you have the posture of someone who's doing something they've decided they're going to do regardless of the consequences. A pause. I've worked around soldiers my whole adult life. I know the posture. He looked at her. She looked back. He turned his screen slightly so she could see the document. She read it for a moment, then, Colonel Voss. She runs program oversight for the region. She's going to come here. Probably. That's going to make Hargrove's day significantly worse. That's not why I called her. I know, Evelyn said, but it's still going to happen. She stood. I'm going to go back and sit with Kodiak until you tell me I have to leave. If Hargrove, I know, she said. If he shows up, I'll handle it. He almost said something about that, about the specific way she said, I'll handle it, which sounded less like I'll manage the situation and more like I've been in worse rooms than Elliot Hargrove. He didn't say it because it wasn't necessary. She left. He went back to the document. At 16:17, Lieutenant Brooks knocked on his doorframe. There's a vehicle at the east gate, he said. His voice had that particular quality of someone delivering news they aren't sure is good or bad. Military plates. 2 officers. They're asking for you. Pierce stood. Did they identify themselves? One of them did. Name's Major Sylvia Crane. She says she's here on behalf of Colonel Voss. Brooks paused. The other one didn't give a name. He's in civilian clothes, but he's got a clearance badge that security flagged when they ran it. Flagged how? The system returned a code instead of a name, Brooks said. Security called me because they didn't know what to do with it. Pierce recognized the shape of that too. Clear them through, he said. Put them in the conference room. I'll be there in 5 minutes. He went to Block 7 first. Evelyn was on the floor beside Kodiak's enclosure. Wills was cross-legged against the wall opposite, watching the dog the way Evelyn had shown her, not actively, not pressurizingly, just present. Kodiak's color was better. His breathing was slow and even. He was not, Pierce assessed, dying right now. "There are 2 officers at the East Gate," Pierce told Evelyn. "One is from Voss's office. The other has a clearance badge that the system won't read." Evelyn went very still. Just for a second. A fraction of a second. But Pierce had been watching people manage their reactions for 22 years, and he caught it. "A clearance badge the system won't read," she said carefully. "System returned a code." She looked at Kodiak. Her hand rested on the enclosure fence, fingers threaded through the chain link, the old dog's nose close to her knuckles. "What code?" she said. He told her. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. He counted those too. "That's the same code," she said quietly, "as mine." Pierce stood very still. The shape of the morning rearranged itself in his mind, which he hadn't thought was possible given how many times he'd already rearranged it. The classified service record, the commendation from a unit that didn't exist, the field kit with the specific pharmaceuticals, the skill set that didn't come from a nursing program, and now a man with a clearance badge that matched the code on her sealed file, appearing at the east gate of Redstone Air Base within 6 hours of her being here. "Someone flagged your presence on the base," he said. "Probably." Her voice was steady. "Or someone's been tracking the flag on my file. And this location triggered it." "Who are they?" She was quiet for a moment. Her fingers were still at the chain link. Kodiak's nose was still against her knuckles. "The woman, Crane, is probably exactly what she says she is. Voss's oversight officer. She's here for the dogs." She paused. "The man in civilian clothes is here for something else." "For you?" "Possibly." She didn't sound frightened. She sounded like someone processing a situation with all the information they have, which was a different thing entirely. Or for confirmation, or for containment. She finally looked at Pierce. "I don't know which. I haven't been findable for a while. 7 years is a long time to be outside a system." "Are you in danger?" She considered the question seriously, which told him it was a question worth considering. "I don't think so," she said, "but I thought that before too, and I was wrong once." Pierce looked at her for a long moment. "Come with me," he said. "Conference room. That's walking directly into whatever that is." "I know, but you've been managing the unknown alone all day. That ends now." He held the doorway. "You don't have to tell them anything. You don't have to say a word. But you're going to be in that room where I can see you, and they're going to be in that room where I can see them. And if this is something that should have happened with proper process and documentation, then it's going to have proper process and documentation." She looked at him. At Kodiak. Back at him. She stood up. "Wills," she said without turning around. "Same rules. Don't rush him. Don't reach." "Yes, ma'am," Wills said quietly. They walked out of Block 7 into the gray afternoon. The mountain clouds that Pierce had noticed that morning now fully descended into the lower elevations, the air cold and carrying the metallic smell that came before snow. He walked, and Evelyn walked beside him, and neither of them said anything until they reached the administration building. At the door, she stopped. "Pierce," she said. "Yeah." "Whatever's in that room, whatever he says, whatever paperwork he has, you don't owe me anything." She looked at him straight. "You helped me this morning because of the dogs. That's sufficient reason. Whatever happens next, that's mine to deal with." Pierce looked at her. She meant it. He could tell she meant it, that this was not performance or false modesty, but the habit of a person who had spent years operating without the expectation that anyone would stay in the room with her. "I called Voss," he said. "I built the document package. I walked you to this building." He opened the door. "I'm not in the habit of doing things halfway." She held his gaze for a second, then she went through the door. The conference room was at the end of the hall, and through the narrow window beside the door, Pierce could see 2 people standing. A woman in uniform who was Major Crane, who looked exactly like what she'd said she was, and a man in a gray jacket who was standing with his back half-turned, looking at the wall. The man turned when they came through the door. He was perhaps 60, silver-haired, with a face that had been arranged by decades into something almost entirely neutral. He looked at Pierce first, briefly, assessingly, and then he looked at Evelyn. Something happened in his expression. Not much. A small movement that Pierce, watching carefully, read as recognition, and beneath it something more complicated. Evelyn, the man said. Evelyn had gone very still the moment she saw him. Her voice, when she spoke, was controlled with the specific quality of control that people use when they need to keep something contained and they are not entirely certain they can. Director Marsh, she said, and the entire day, Pierce realized, had just become something completely different from what he'd thought it was. The room held that silence for 3 full seconds. Pierce had been in enough high-stakes rooms to know the difference between a chance that meant nothing and a chance that meant something was being decided, by everyone, simultaneously, without a word spoken. This was the second kind. Major Crane had gone carefully still near the window. Evelyn hadn't moved since she'd said the name, and Director Marsh stood with his hands loose at his sides, watching her with an expression that Pierce was reading as complicated in ways he couldn't fully map yet. "It's been a while," Marsh said. He said it like a fact, not an accusation. 7 years? Evelyn said. 6.5. I wasn't counting precisely. Marsh almost smiled. Not quite. His eyes moved to Pierce, and the assessment in them was fast and thorough, the kind that came from a career of reading rooms quickly. "Master Sergeant Pierce, thank you for the contact with Colonel Voss. That's actually what brought us here." "I called Colonel Voss about the dogs," Pierce said. "I know, but your incident documentation mentioned Carter by name, and Carter's name sitting in a formal military document attached to a regional oversight inquiry is the kind of thing that surfaces in systems she's connected to." He paused. "Systems that are still watching." Evelyn let out a breath that was very controlled. "I've been a civilian for 6 years, Marsh." "You've had civilian employment for 6 years, he said carefully. "Those aren't the same thing, and you know it." He turned to Major Crane. "Could you give us a few minutes?" Crane looked at Pierce. Pierce nodded. She left, closing the door with the kind of careful quiet that meant she was absolutely going to stay within earshot in the hallway. Pierce stayed. Marsh looked at him. "This is her business," Marsh said. "She's on my base," Pierce said. "That makes it mine, too." Marsh studied him for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. He pulled out a chair and sat down, which changed the geometry of the room, made it less like a confrontation and more like something else, something that Pierce didn't have a word for yet. "Sit down," Marsh said to both of them. Pierce sat. Evelyn sat slowly, on the edge of the chair farthest from Marsh, which was a detail he noted. "I'm not here to pull you back in," Marsh said to Evelyn. "I want to start with that." "Then what are you here for?" "To understand the situation, to assess the exposure." He folded his hands on the table. "When your name appeared in Pierce's documentation, the system flagged it as a potential classification concern. I came personally because I wanted to determine the scope before anyone else got involved." "The scope," Evelyn said, flat. "Your service record is sealed. The unit designation is sealed. If any of what you did here today requires explaining in a formal proceeding, then it exposes things that were supposed to stay covered." "Yes." The word sat in the room. Pierce looked at Evelyn. She was watching Marsh with an expression he recognized now. The controlled distance, the managed surface, but underneath it something he hadn't seen before, or hadn't seen clearly. Not anger, not fear. Something older than both of those. "So you came to assess whether I'm a liability," she said. "I came to assess the situation," Marsh said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Marsh held her gaze. "Evelyn, you walked onto a military installation with a field kit that belongs to a program that officially doesn't exist and performed a cardiac intervention on a military working dog. That is going to generate documentation. That documentation is going to be reviewed." He leaned forward slightly. "I need to know what happened here today, and I need to know all of it, because if this goes to a formal inquiry, I need to be ahead of it." The room was quiet. Then Evelyn did something that Pierce didn't expect. She looked at Marsh directly without the managed distance, and she said, 6 dogs, combat veterans, in acute crisis because the administrator of this facility cut their behavioral health contract to save $11,000. Her voice was even. "One of them was dying this afternoon. I stabilized him. That's what happened. That's all of it." Marsh held her gaze for a long moment. "That's not quite all of it," he said quietly. "Everything else," she said, "was before today. And you know everything that was before today." Another silence. Pierce had been building a picture of Evelyn Carter since 700 that morning, adding pieces as they came in, and the picture was now detailed enough that he could see what Marsh was not saying, which was that whatever Evelyn had done in her years before civilian life, the classified work, the sealed record, the commendation from a unit that didn't officially exist, had not been without cost to her, and that Marsh knew what that cost was, and that the man sitting across from her in a gray jacket and a clearance badge was not purely an administrator. He was something more personally tangled in what had happened to her than the word director suggested. Pierce filed that away and said nothing. But the next 40 minutes were procedural in the way that significant things sometimes are, forms under the bureaucracy, the actual weight hidden in the language of process. Marsh and Major Crane reviewed Pierce's incident documentation. Crane made notes. Marsh asked 4 questions, all of them precise, and none of them what Pierce expected him to ask, which told Pierce that Marsh already had most of the information and was verifying specifics. Evelyn answered 2 of the 4 questions. The other 2 she declined to answer, and Marsh did not push. What emerged from the review, laid out in the flat language of incident reports and vet logs and access records, was a morning that was substantially worse than Hargrove's version of it. The 6 dogs had been in documented distress for 43 days. Finch had filed 4 written recommendations over that period, all of which had been received and noted by Hargrove's office, and none of which had generated a response. The behavioral contract had been terminated without veterinary consultation in violation of base welfare protocol. Private Rourke's injury that morning was the 4th handler injury from Block 7 in 6 weeks. The first 3 had been recorded as minor incidents and not escalated. Crane read through the incident log with an expression that got progressively flatter, which Pierce understood as a woman who was professionally angry and was managing it the way her rank required. Director Hargrove signed off on all 4 of Finch's recommendations as received, Crane said. She was talking to Marsh, but she said it in a way that meant the room. I see that, Marsh said. Received but not acted on. The contract termination memo. Crane held up a page. This references a budget reallocation to facility maintenance. What maintenance? Pierce kept his face neutral. I don't have visibility into that. I'd like visibility into that, she said, in a tone that meant she was going to get it. Marsh closed the document folder. He looked at Pierce. Who else knows about Carter's background? Dr. Finch knows something's unusual. Lieutenant Brooks pulled what he could access from the record, which was the classification code. Nobody else. The classification code is sufficient to raise questions, Marsh said. It's sufficient to make anyone who looks at it understand that she served in a context outside standard records, Pierce said. That's all they'd know. That's enough. With respect, Director, that's not the problem right now. Pierce kept his voice level. The problem right now is that those 6 dogs are still in a facility that doesn't have adequate support, and the man responsible for that is currently building a formal complaint about the woman who kept one of them from dying this afternoon. He paused. Whatever exposure concern brought you here, I'd suggest the more immediate situation is that Hargrove has a 1,700 documentation deadline and he is going to use it. Marsh looked at him for a long moment. He already submitted it, Crane said quietly. She was looking at her phone. At 1648. To the Regional Administrative Review Board and to Base Security. The room shifted. Evelyn was very still. What did it say? Pierce said. Crane read from her phone, summarizing without editorializing, which was its own form of editorial. Unauthorized civilian access. Potential security breach. Revoked credentials ignored by on-base personnel. Possible misuse of military resources. Recommendation for formal review of personnel involved, specifically naming Master Sergeant Logan Pierce and Dr. Rosario Finch. Pierce sat with that for a moment. He'd known it was coming. Knowing didn't make it land differently. He didn't name Carter, Crane noted. He doesn't know enough about her to name her effectively, Marsh said. He named the people he can reach. He's trying to control the narrative, Evelyn said. She said it without heat, just observing the shape of it. If the inquiry focuses on Pierce and Finch violating protocol, it doesn't focus on what generated the situation in the first place. Marsh looked at her. He's done this before, she said. It wasn't a question. That's outside my remit to... It's not a classified question, she said. It's an administrative one. Has Hargrove filed preemptive documentation in previous situations where his own decisions were about to face review? Crane and Marsh exchanged a look. The look lasted less than 2 seconds, but Pierce caught it. There have been previous inquiries, Crane said carefully, and they were resolved at the administrative level, meaning they were managed before they reached formal review. Meaning they were resolved, Crane said again. Evelyn nodded slowly. So this is a pattern. The word pattern sat in the room like a stone dropped in water. Pierce called Finch at 17:15. He stepped into the corridor to do it, leaving Marsh and Crane with the documents, leaving Evelyn sitting in the conference room with the particular stillness of someone who is not doing nothing, who is in fact doing the very specific thing of waiting and thinking and preparing, all of which look from the outside like nothing. Finch picked up on the first ring. I was about to call you, she said. Hargrove filed at 1648, Review Board and Base Security. He named you. A pause. Of course he did. Her voice was flat. What's the exposure? Protocol violation for allowing civilian access. Possibly more depending on what they want to make of the field kit. The field kit saved Kodiak's life. I know that. Does the Review Board know that? They will, Pierce said. How is he? Stable. Better than this morning. I've arranged transport to the Fort Ralston Animal Facility for tomorrow morning. I called in a favor with their senior vet. Hargrove hasn't approved it yet, but I submitted the request through the Welfare Protocol channel, which bypasses his desk if I cite urgent medical necessity. Cite it. Already did. A pause. Pierce, are you in trouble? He thought about that. Probably. Does that change anything on your end? No, she said without hesitation. I documented everything correctly. If they want to review my documentation, they can review it. He went back into the conference room. Marsh was on his phone in the corner. Crane had organized the documents into 2 separate stacks and was writing something in a notebook with the focused efficiency of someone building a case. Evelyn was still in her chair, but she'd shifted. She was looking at the table, at her own hands, at something that wasn't in the room. Pierce sat down across from her. You okay? He said, low enough that it was only for her. She looked up. Define okay. Functional. Then, yes. She looked back at her hands. He's going to argue that your violation of his instructions endangered the facility. The field kit is going to be the centerpiece. He'll say I brought unauthorized pharmaceuticals onto a military installation and that you enabled it. That's going to be a hard argument to make against a documented cardiac event and a dog that didn't die. Hard arguments get made all the time, she said. You know that. He did know that. Marsh, she said, quieter still. He said he's not here to pull me back in. I believe him on that specific point, but he's also here to protect the integrity of the sealed record. And if Hargrove's inquiry gets wide enough to require explaining my background, Marsh is going to have to choose between letting my service become visible and letting the inquiry define me on its own terms. Which would he choose? She was quiet for a moment. I don't know anymore. I used to know. Pierce looked at her, at the careful control of her face, the way she held herself, not rigid, but contained, like someone who'd learned that the space between feeling something and showing it was the space where you survived. What happened between you and Marsh? He said. She shook her head, not refusing exactly. More like the answer was too long for this room. Then tell me what you need, he said. Right now, in this situation, what do you need? She thought about it seriously, which he'd come to understand was her default. She did not answer questions without actually engaging them. I need Hargrove's pattern to be visible, she said. Not just today. The full picture. 4 months of ignored recommendations, 3 previous handler injuries not escalated, the contract cut without consultation. She paused. If this inquiry becomes about protocol violations, the dogs lose. Pierce and Finch lose. Hargrove walks. If the inquiry becomes about what has actually been happening in Block 7 for 6 months, then the framing flips, Pierce said. Yes. Marsh ended his call and came back to the table. He sat down. He looked at both of them with the expression of a man who has just been on the phone with someone who ranked above him and had received information he was still integrating. There's been a development, he said, The development, as Marsh explained it in the careful language of someone choosing each word for its legal weight, was that the Regional Administrative Review Board had received Hargrove's complaint at 1648 and had also, independently through a separate channel that Pierce had not anticipated, received Colonel Voss's preliminary inquiry request, which had arrived at 1702. Two simultaneous submissions, different angles, both referencing Redstone Air Base, Block 7, and the events of the morning. The review board had flagged the collision and escalated to the next level, which meant that what had been a base-level administrative matter was now a regional matter, and a regional matter meant a site inspection, which meant people coming to Redstone from outside Redstone, people who did not report to Hargrove and had not been reading his version of events for 6 months. When? Pierce said. They're targeting 48 hours, Crane said. Given the dual submission, they want to move before documentation gets... She stopped, chose a different word. Before the record solidifies. Before anyone could shape what the inspectors would find, she meant. Before Hargrove could spend 2 days preparing his version. Pierce looked at the table. 48 hours. He could work with 48 hours. There's a condition, Marsh said. He was looking at Evelyn. The board is aware of an unidentified civilian with a classification-coded record who is present during the incident. They want a formal identification and a scope statement. Evelyn held Marsh's gaze. A scope statement? Confirming the nature and limits of your involvement, so that if the inquiry expands, they know what they're working with. And if I decline? Marsh was quiet for a moment. Then the classification flag on your record becomes part of the inquiry, and the inquiry gets complicated in ways that take it out of my hands and into a process that I cannot control and you will not enjoy. The room was very quiet. Pierce watched Evelyn's face. He watched her process it, not with panic, not with anger, but with the focused assessment of someone who had been in situations with limited options before and had learned to work with what was available rather than mourning what wasn't. A scope statement, she said again, covering today. Covering your presence on this installation, your background as relevant to understanding your actions, and your involvement in the welfare of the animals in Block 7. Not the prior service. Not in detail, Marsh said. Enough to contextualize. The classification stays. She looked at her hands, then at Pierce, then at the window, where the gray afternoon had shifted to the particular darkness that comes before a mountain snowfall, the sky pressing down low and close. Okay, she said. Marsh nodded once. The tension in his shoulders shifted, not disappeared, but redistributed. There's one more thing, he said. He reached into his jacket and placed a folder on the table. He slid it toward Evelyn. Before the inspection team arrives, I need you to look at something. She opened the folder. Pierce watched her read. He watched her expression do something he hadn't seen from her all day. A small, involuntary movement in her face, a flicker at the corner of her mouth that was not quite what he'd call an emotion, but was the trace of one, buried quickly. Where did this come from? She said. It was in the base records, Marsh said. Hargrove's office. Scanned and filed under veterinary administration. Pierce leaned forward slightly. He couldn't read the document from his angle. What is it? Evelyn looked at him. She looked at the folder. She turned it so he could see. It was a scanned photograph. Old, slightly degraded, the kind of digital scan made from a physical print. It showed a woman who was clearly Evelyn Carter, younger, in field clothes he couldn't precisely identify, crouched beside a large black dog in what appeared to be a rocky outdoor environment. The woman in the photograph had her hands on the dog's side, and the dog had its head turned toward her. On the surface of the photograph, someone had written 2 lines in black marker, but they'd been partially redacted, blacked out in the scan, so that only the last 4 words remained legible. Pierce read them. Never abandon your partner. That photograph, Evelyn said very quietly, should not exist in any accessible file. I know, Marsh said. It was classified with everything else. I know, he said again. His voice had something in it now, something that Pierce heard as the discomfort of a person who is responsible for something going wrong and is present for the consequences. It was scanned into the base veterinary records 8 months ago. By someone in Hargrove's administrative team as part of a routine records consolidation. They wouldn't have known what they were looking at. But once it was in the base record, It was accessible to anyone with administrative clearance, Marsh said. Yes. Evelyn sat back. She looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she looked at Marsh with the clearest, most direct gaze Pierce had seen from her all day. Who's the dog? Pierce said. He asked it quietly, half expecting not to get an answer. Evelyn looked at the photograph. His name was Ranger, she said. He was a Belgian Malinois. He was assigned to my unit for 4 years. She paused. He died on a mission that doesn't have an official record. So did his handler. Another pause, shorter. I was the last person with him. The room held that. The words on the back, Pierce said. He wrote them, she said. The handler. He wrote it on the back of the photograph and gave it to me 2 days before the mission. She looked at the folder. I didn't know a copy existed. Marsh said nothing. For once he said nothing, and the nothing was the right call. At 18:30, Hargrove walked into the administration building. Pierce knew he was coming because Brooks texted him from the front desk, and he had 40 seconds to make a decision about where everyone was going to be when Hargrove arrived. He decided on the truth of the situation, which was that the conference room contained 2 people with clearances Hargrove couldn't read, and documentation that was now in the hands of a regional review board, and the correct move was not to manage the encounter but to let it happen in full. He stood up. He's coming in. Marsh and Crane exchanged a glance. Marsh straightened in his chair. Crane closed her notebook with the particular care of someone who doesn't want their notes to be visible to the next person through the door. Evelyn said nothing. She put the folder on the table in front of her, face down, and folded her hands. Hargrove opened the conference room door with the air of a man who owns the space he's entering and stopped when he saw what the space contained. He looked at Marsh, at Crane, at the military insignia on Crane's uniform, back at Marsh at the badge on his jacket, the badge that base security had flagged and could not read. He looked at Evelyn. His expression went through several things in rapid succession: surprise, reassessment, something that might have been the beginning of concern, and then it settled back into the controlled authority register he used in administrative situations. Director Hargrove, Pierce said, this is Major Crane from Colonel Voss's Regional Oversight Office, and this is Director Marsh. He did not explain what Marsh directed. They've been reviewing the incident documentation. I wasn't notified of a review meeting, Hargrove said. It wasn't a review meeting, Crane said. It was a preliminary document assessment, standard procedure following a dual submission to the regional board. Dual submission, Hargrove said it carefully. I submitted one complaint. Colonel Voss submitted a separate oversight inquiry through the welfare protocol channel, Crane said. The board received both and escalated. Site inspection in 48 hours. The controlled authority register slipped. Only slightly. A tightening around the eyes, a fractional shift in posture. But Pierce had been watching Hargrove's face all day, and he caught it. That's premature, Hargrove said. The situation was an internal incident that... The situation, Crane said, involved a documented pattern of welfare protocol violations over a 43-day period and 4 ignored veterinary recommendations from the on-base vet. That's the scope that triggered escalation. She held his gaze. Not the complaint you filed, Director. The pattern your complaint inadvertently documented. Silence. Hargrove looked at Pierce. The look had layers, anger, certainly, but beneath it something that Pierce recognized as the specific fear of a person who has understood, in a single moment, that the ground they thought they were standing on has changed. You, he said. Quiet. Just the word. Sir, Pierce said, equally quiet. You went to Voss. I provided accurate documentation of a welfare emergency to the appropriate regional oversight authority. Yes, sir. Hargrove looked around the room, at Crane, at Marsh, at the folders on the table, at Evelyn, who had not moved, who had her hands folded and her face arranged into the careful neutral she'd been carrying all day, and whose presence in this room was something he had clearly not anticipated. Miss Carter, he said, your access to this facility was revoked. It was, she agreed. You re-entered on revoked credentials. I did. He waited for something more. An apology, a justification, a concession of some kind. She gave him none of those things. She just looked at him with the expression of someone who has very little left to defend and therefore nothing to apologize for. Director Hargrove, Marsh said. His voice had the particular quality of authority that comes not from volume, but from certainty. The review board will want to speak with you as part of the site inspection. I'd recommend you make your administrative files available proactively, budget reallocation decisions over the past 6 months specifically, and correspondence with the veterinary staff. He paused. Proactive cooperation reads significantly better in a formal inquiry than responsive compliance. Hargrove stood in the doorway. He was a man who operated from control, controlled information, controlled process, controlled narrative, and every form of control he'd had over this day had been systematically removed, and Pierce could see him trying to find one he still held. He didn't find it. "I'll speak with my legal advisor," he said, and left. The door closed. Nobody in the conference room said anything for a moment. Then Finch's voice came over Pierce's radio, and it was not the clinical flat voice she used in emergencies, and it was not the controlled anger voice she used with Hargrove's memos. It was something different, lighter. "Pierce," she said, "Kodiak just ate. First time in 3 days. He cleaned the bowl." Pierce closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. When he opened them, Evelyn was looking at him, and the controlled distance on her face had shifted into something real, something that had no performance in it at all. Something that he thought was probably what she looked like when she was not managing anything. "Good dog," she said, quiet, to nobody in particular. The 48 hours before the inspection were not calm. Hargrove's legal advisor contacted the base JAG office at 0800 the following morning, and the JAG contact triggered a conversation between the base commander, Brigadier General Owen Taft, who had been largely above the day-to-day of the Block 7 situation, but was emphatically not above a regional inspection, and Colonel Voss, who gave Taft a summary of the situation that took 11 minutes and left Taft in the kind of quiet that precedes significant decisions. Taft called Pierce at 0900. "Give me your honest account," Taft said. "Not the incident report. Your account." Pierce gave it. He took 20 minutes and left nothing out, including his own protocol violations, including Evelyn's revoked credentials, including the field kit, including Marsh and what Marsh represented. Taft was quiet for a long moment when Pierce finished. "The civilian," he said. "Carter. She's protected under a classification I can't access." "Yes, sir." "Is she a risk to this base?" "No, sir. She's the reason Kodiak is alive, and 6 dogs that were in active crisis yesterday morning are stable today." Another silence. "Do you trust her?" The question was direct enough that Pierce gave it the respect of a direct answer. "Yes, sir." Taft hung up. Pierce found out later from Brooks, who found out from Taft's aide, that Taft had then called Hargrove, and that the conversation had lasted 4 minutes, and that Hargrove had emerged from his office afterward and canceled 3 meetings and spent the rest of the morning in his office with the door closed. The inspection team arrived at 0900 on the second day. 2 officers and an administrative auditor, all from the regional board, none of whom had any prior contact with Redstone. They worked systematically, and they did not telegraph their conclusions, which Pierce had known to expect and which Finch handled better than he anticipated, presenting her documentation with the thoroughness of someone who had been keeping records precisely because she suspected she'd eventually need them. The budget reallocation that Crane had flagged 2 days earlier, the line item Hargrove had cited in the contract termination memo, turned out, under the auditor's review, to reference a facility maintenance project that had itself been completed 4 months prior to the contract cut, meaning the funds had already been spent, meaning the reallocation was either an accounting error or something else. The auditor used the phrase irregular accounting in her preliminary notes. Pierce was not in the room when that happened. He found out from Crane, who texted him 2 words. "It's there." He read those 2 words sitting outside Block 7, where through the chain link he could hear the low, settled sounds of 6 dogs in something that was finally, cautiously, beginning to resemble rest. Evelyn was with Dust when the preliminary findings came through. She'd been there most of the morning, not because anyone had asked her to be, not because she had credentials or authorization or any formal standing on the base at all. She was there because Marsh had spoken with Taft, and Taft had made a phone call, and somewhere in the chain of calls, a temporary consultation status had been issued that gave her presence a technical legitimacy. Though everyone involved understood that the legitimacy was retroactive and the presence had preceded it by most of 2 days. Dust was out of his corner. Not at the fence, not yet, but out of the corner, sitting in the middle of his enclosure with his head up, watching Evelyn on the other side of the chain link with the careful attention of a dog who was doing the very slow work of deciding something. Corporal Wills was cross-legged on the floor 6 feet away, not looking at Dust directly, doing the thing Evelyn had taught her, which was to be present without being demanding. She'd been doing it for an hour. Pierce, coming to find Evelyn, stopped in the doorway and watched for a moment. The kennel, which 36 hours ago had been a space of sustained, low-register terror, was different now. Not peaceful. That would be overstating it, and Evelyn would be the first to say so. But different. The air had changed. Something in the collective register of the animals had shifted from crisis to something that was not yet safety, but was moving in its direction. "Preliminary findings are in," Pierce said from the doorway. Evelyn looked up. Irregular accounting on the budget reallocation. 4 ignored welfare recommendations with documented receipt. 3 prior handler injuries not escalated in violation of protocol. He paused. The team is recommending formal administrative review of Hargrove's decisions over the past 8 months. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Dust, who had shifted slightly, turned his head, ears moving, processing something at the edge of his range. 8 months, she said, not 6. They went back further than the contract cut, Pierce said. There were earlier decisions. She nodded slowly. She'd expected that. Pierce had expected that she'd expected it. "What happens to him?" she said. "Hargrove. I don't know yet. The formal review process takes time." He paused. "But Taft has placed him on administrative leave pending the outcome. Effective this morning." Evelyn absorbed that. She didn't look triumphant. She didn't look relieved exactly. She looked like someone who has watched an inevitable thing happen and is feeling the weight of the fact that it needed to happen at all. "The dogs," she said. "They'll need a full behavioral rehabilitation plan. Not just maintenance. The fear patterns are established. They're going to take months of consistent work to reroute, and it has to be the same handlers, same approach, same schedule. You can't rotate people through." "I know. Finch and I are building the plan. I want your input before you leave." She looked at him. "Before you leave," he repeated carefully. "Because you're going to. I'm not pretending otherwise." She was quiet. "But before that," he said, "I need everything you can give me. On paper. Specific to each dog. What you observed, what you recommended, what the approach should be for each one individually." He held her gaze. "Not because I'm asking you to do more work. Because what you know about those 6 animals is not replaceable, and I'm not willing to lose it when you walk out the gate." Dust moved. Both of them went still. The dog took 2 steps toward the fence, slow, testing. His nose came up. He scented the air, scented Evelyn, scented something in the situation that he was apparently finding sufficient. He pressed his nose to the chain link. Wills made a very small sound that she immediately suppressed. Evelyn put her hand to the fence, slowly, and Dust pressed his nose against her knuckles. And then, because the moment apparently required something more, he lay down on his side in the middle of his enclosure with his head toward the fence and let out a long, slow breath. "Okay," Evelyn said quietly, to Pierce, to the room, to nobody in particular. "I'll write the plan." She reached into her canvas bag with her free hand and pulled out a worn notebook. Not a phone, not a tablet, an actual physical notebook, and she set it on her knee and began to write, with Dust's nose against her knuckles through the fence, in handwriting that Pierce, catching a glimpse, saw was small and exact, and covered the page in a way that suggested she had been writing things down precisely and carefully for a very long time. He left her to it. He was halfway down the corridor when his phone buzzed. Brooks. The message was 4 words and a question mark. Did you know she had one? Pierce stopped walking, typed back. Had what? The answer came in 30 seconds, and it arrived with an attached image. A scan, grainy, the kind made from a physical document. It was a service record extract. Not Evelyn's. A different name, different rank. It was the record of a woman who had served under a classified unit designation between 15 and 22 years ago, in a role that the document described only by a code number, and whose listed commendations included a citation that referenced in redacted text actions during a non-official engagement in an undisclosed location. The name at the top of the document was not a name Pierce had heard before, but the photograph in the upper left corner, degraded, small, scanned from an old print, showed a woman who was unmistakably a younger version of Evelyn Carter, and the date of service on the document began 9 years earlier than Evelyn had told him. Pierce stood in the corridor of Block 7 for a long moment, holding his phone, looking at the photograph of a woman who was 22 years old in the image and who he now understood had not been 24 when she started the work she'd described as beginning 8 years ago. She'd been 15 years in this, not 7. Not the 6.5 that Marsh had counted. 15 years in programs she hadn't named, under identities she hadn't disclosed, doing work that had no official record and left no traceable path. And the only reason Pierce was looking at this document right now was that someone, in the course of an administrative records consolidation 8 months ago, had scanned a photograph into a base file that was never supposed to hold it. And someone else, 8 months later, had apparently noticed and pulled the original. He scrolled down on the message. Below the attached image, Brooks had typed one more line. This came from Hargrove's office. It was in the records the auditor pulled this morning. Master Sergeant, someone in that office has been sitting on this for 8 months. Pierce stood in the corridor for another 30 seconds, holding his phone, making himself think clearly. 15 years. Not 7. Not the careful, edited version Evelyn had offered in the conference room, the version designed to explain enough without exposing more. 15 years of classified service under at least 2 different identities, in programs that didn't officially exist, doing work that the document in front of him could only gesture at through redaction and code. And Hargrove's office had been sitting on a piece of that for 8 months. The question was whether Hargrove knew what he had. Pierce thought about that carefully, because the answer mattered. If Hargrove had found the photograph in the records consolidation and recognized it as sensitive and filed it away as potential leverage, that was one thing. If someone in his administrative team had scanned it without understanding what it was, and it had simply sat in a file, unseen, until the auditor pulled everything, that was another thing entirely. He typed back to Brooks. Who in Hargrove's office handled the records consolidation 8 months ago? The answer came in 2 minutes. Administrative assistant. Name is Terry Galt. She's been on leave since last week. Personal leave. Pre-approved. Pierce stared at that for a moment. Then he forwarded the entire exchange to Marsh. Marsh called him back in 4 minutes. I see it, Marsh said. His voice had a quality Pierce hadn't heard from him before. Tighter, stripped of the careful diplomatic register. How did Brooks get access to the auditor's pull? I didn't ask him that, Pierce said. A pause. Smart. What does it mean? The earlier record. Marsh was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to tell Pierce something. It means her service was longer and more complex than what she's disclosed to the review board. It means the scope statement she provided yesterday was accurate but not complete. Another pause. It also means that if someone in Hargrove's office has been aware of this document for 8 months and chose not to report it through classification channels, which is the required protocol when you find a document that shouldn't be where it is, then there's a separate compliance issue that goes significantly beyond the welfare violations. How significantly? Significantly enough that it moves from an administrative review to something that involves my office directly. Marsh's voice was flat. Pierce, don't say anything to Carter yet. I need an hour. He hung up. Pierce put his phone in his pocket. He stood in the corridor outside Block 7 listening to the sound of 6 dogs and something approaching quiet, and thought about a woman sitting 20 feet away writing in a worn notebook, who had told him 7 years and meant 15, and who had every reason in the world to keep the fuller truth in a place nobody could reach it. He went back to the doorway of Dust's kennel and leaned against the frame. Evelyn was still writing. Dust was still on his side, head toward the fence, breathing the long, slow breath of an animal that had decided, provisionally and with significant reservations, to let down a fraction of its guard. Wills had fallen asleep sitting against the wall, which Pierce noted without waking her, because she'd been awake since 0500, and the sleep was more useful than the watch. He looked at Evelyn's notebook. The page was dense with specific, precise observations, behavioral notes, trigger patterns, recommended approaches broken down by individual dog, written in the hand of someone who had been doing this kind of documentation for a long time, not the documentation of a temporary ER nurse covering a maternity leave, the documentation of someone trained to record field observations accurately and completely under pressure. 15 years. He thought about what those 15 years looked like from the inside. The missions without records, the work without credit, the photograph that existed in a classified file, and on the back of which a dead man had written 4 words that she'd carried for however long she'd been carrying them. The 6.5 years since, the civilian life that wasn't quite civilian, the careful distance from everything she'd done, the temporary credentials and the temporary positions, and the canvas medical bag and the hard-sided case she'd brought, because some part of her had never fully stopped being the person she'd been before. She looked up from the notebook and found him looking at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Keep writing." She looked at him for a second longer, that assessing look, reading the room the way she read everything, and then she looked back at the notebook. She kept writing. Marsh arrived at Block 7 40 minutes later. He didn't come alone. He came with Major Crane and with a woman Pierce hadn't met, civilian clothes, mid-50s, carrying a leather portfolio that said nothing specific about who she was, but that Pierce read, from the way Marsh deferred to her without subordinating himself, as someone from a different branch of the same obscure tree. Evelyn heard them coming down the corridor. She looked up when they stopped in the doorway. She looked at the woman with the portfolio the way you look at something you've been expecting. "Dr. Lena Farr," the woman said. She didn't extend her hand. "Office of Special Programs Review." Evelyn closed her notebook. "I see. We need to talk. All of us." Farr looked at Wills, who had woken up when the footsteps arrived and was now sitting very straight against the wall pretending she hadn't been asleep. "Wills," Pierce said, "take a break." Wills stood, cast one look at Dust, who was still on his side, still breathing slow, watching the new arrivals with ears up but body relaxed, and left. They stood in the corridor, the 5 of them, and Dr. Farr opened her portfolio and placed 3 documents on the shelf of the nearest kennel gate. "The document Brooks found in the auditor's pull," she said, without preamble, "is one of 4 that were incorrectly filed during the records consolidation 8 months ago. The other 3 were in a separate administrative folder that Hargrove's office created for what was labeled historical base records. None of them were reported through classification channels." She looked at Evelyn. "2 of the 4 relate to your service. 1 relates to a different individual whose identity I won't discuss here. The 4th is an operational summary that has no business within 500 miles of a base administrative file." Evelyn's face was completely still. "Has anyone outside this chain accessed them?" she said. "We don't believe so. The file was created by Galt, who appears to have been following a general consolidation directive without understanding the content. There's no evidence Hargrove opened the folder after it was created." Farr paused. "There is some evidence he knew the folder existed and chose not to review it, which is its own problem." "Chose not to review it," Evelyn said slowly. "Deliberately avoided," Farr said, "which, from a legal standpoint, does not protect him. Constructive knowledge of a mishandled classified document carries the same obligation as actual knowledge." The shape of it assembled itself in the corridor, and Pierce watched Evelyn take it in. The particular quality of a person who has just been handed information that changes something they'd believed to be settled. "He could have used those documents against her," Pierce said to the room. "He didn't. He also didn't report them," Crane said, "which is the legal failure." "But he didn't use them," Pierce said again. Marsh nodded, once, slowly, which creates a more complicated picture than straightforward malicious intent. Evelyn said nothing for a moment, then, It means he had leverage he didn't deploy. Whether that's incompetence or something else, I don't know. But it changes the nature of what happened. It doesn't change the welfare violations, Pierce said. The dogs, the contract, the 4 ignored recommendations. No, she said. It doesn't change that. Farr closed her portfolio. The mishandled documents are being retrieved and resecured today. Your service record is being fully resealed with updated protocols. The breach will be investigated separately from the base welfare review. She looked at Evelyn with the direct gaze of someone who has delivered bad news and good news in the same breath enough times to have developed a particular style for it. Ms. Carter, I'm here because Director Marsh requested that this conversation happen in person, and because there are decisions that need to be made that are yours to make. What decisions? Evelyn said. Farr reached into her portfolio and placed one more document on the kennel gate. Pierce could see it from where he stood. It had a header he couldn't read from his angle and a signature block at the bottom. Evelyn picked it up. She read it. She read it twice, which told Pierce something. Full recognition, she said. Not a question. Your complete service record, restored and declassified at the appropriate level for formal military recognition. All 15 years. Farr's voice was even. It was recommended by Director Marsh's office and approved at the level above his. The welfare crisis at Redstone, combined with the document breach, created a situation where the rationale for continued concealment of your service was outweighed by the record of what you've actually done. The rationale for concealment, Evelyn said, was protecting operational security. The operations you were part of have been formally closed. The security concerns have been reviewed. Farr held her gaze. The people who made the original decision to seal your record made it under different circumstances. Circumstances that no longer exist. Evelyn looked at the document. The corridor was quiet. Somewhere down the block, one of the dogs shifted, the small sounds of living things finding their positions, and Pierce stood against the wall and gave the moment the space it required. What does recognition mean, practically? Evelyn said. Formal service acknowledgement. The commendations that were sealed become part of your official record. Back pay adjustment for the classified service period. VA eligibility restored. Farr paused. And your name goes on the record of the unit. All the names, finally, in the right place. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. The handler, she said. Ranger's handler. The one who wrote on the photograph. Marsh spoke quietly. His family was notified last year when the closure process began. His name is in the record. Something moved across Evelyn's face. Fast. Honest. Gone quickly. The way things go that are too real for public display. Okay, she said. She signed the document. The formal site inspection findings were released 6 days later. They were thorough, and they were not gentle, which was not something Pierce had expected from a regional administrative body, but which turned out to be what happened when the documentation was airtight and the auditor was the specific type of professional who found irregular accounting personally offensive. Elliot Hargrove was removed from his position as base director pending a formal disciplinary process. The removal was not announced publicly in the way that organizational failures sometimes are, quietly shuffled into administrative language and buried in procedure. It was documented fully, with findings attached, and those findings went into the same regional record that tracked base welfare compliance across the district. Every base commander in the region received the summary. Every veterinary and handler program in the oversight network received the welfare protocol review. The $11,000 budget line that had killed the behavioral contract was restored. The behavioral health contractor, a woman named Dr. Ida Rourke, no relation to Private Rourke, who had been doing this work for 20 years and had been frustrated but unsurprised to lose the contract, was brought back the week after the findings were released. She arrived, reviewed Evelyn's notebook documentation, and told Pierce it was the most precise field behavioral assessment she'd seen produced outside a clinical setting. Pierce told her who'd written it. Rourke looked at him. The temporary ER nurse. Among other things, Pierce said, Private Denny Rourke, whose arm had healed, who had come back on rotation with the specific determination of someone who has decided that being afraid of something is not the same as being defeated by it, was the first handler to sit with dust outside the fence in the new protocol. He did it for 20 minutes, not asking anything, not reaching, Just being there the way Evelyn had shown Wills to be there. Dust watched him for 18 of those 20 minutes, and then, in the final 2, walked to the fence and stood close. Rourke texted Pierce a photo. Pierce forwarded it to Evelyn. She sent back 3 words. Good. Keep going. Ikat. Kodiak went to Fort Ralston for his cardiac workup on day 3 and came back on day 9 with a medication protocol, a revised activity plan, and a recommendation for a lower stress environment that Finch implemented by giving him the kennel closest to the exterior wall where he could hear the wind in the trees. It was a small adjustment. It mattered. The first morning after the kennel change, he ate his breakfast in under 4 minutes, which Finch documented in the log with the kind of clinical precision that failed to conceal that she was pleased. She told Pierce about it over coffee in her office, and Pierce noticed that the tension she'd been carrying in her shoulders since the welfare review, the tension of someone who has been right for months and ignored for months, and is still carrying the weight of all the things that happened because of that, had shifted. Not gone. Shifted into something she could put down occasionally. What's going to happen to the program, she said. Taft's committed to full staffing restoration. Rourke is back. We're getting a second handler position approved. Pierce held his coffee cup. The rehabilitation protocol is being written into the base welfare standard operating procedure. Evelyn's protocol. Based on her notes, yes. Rourke's formalizing it. Finch nodded. She should be here for that. I know. Is she? Pierce looked at the window. Outside, the mountains were sharp against a sky that had gone fully blue after days of cloud cover, the snow on the upper elevations brilliant in the late morning light. She's leaving Thursday, he said. Finch was quiet. The maternity leave she's covering ends, Pierce said, and she has a thing she needs to do. What thing? She didn't specify, but she said she'd be back in 3 weeks. Finch looked at him. She said she'd be back. She said she'd be back. Finch drank her coffee. Good, she said, in a voice that meant considerably more than the word. That, on Wednesday evening, the night before Evelyn's last full day, Pierce found her in the kennel where Dust had his enclosure. It was after 2,000 hours, and the base had settled into its night routine, the corridors quieter, the mountains outside invisible in the dark except for the ambient light off the snow. She was inside the enclosure. Dust was beside her, not pressed against her, not leaning, beside her, in the way dogs choose to stand near people they have decided are safe, with the specific quality of a voluntary thing. They were both looking at the far wall, which had nothing on it, and the image of the two of them in the kennel light was the kind of thing Pierce thought he would remember for a while. He stood in the doorway without announcing himself. After a moment, Evelyn said, without turning, I know you're there. I know you know, he said. He came in and sat on the floor near the enclosure entrance. Dust looked at him, ears moving, and then looked back at the wall. He let you in, Pierce said. He let me in yesterday, Evelyn said. I've been coming at the same time, same approach, every day. He started coming to the gate on day 2. She looked at the dog. Predictability. It's what they lose out there. Every threat came from somewhere new, on a different schedule, with no pattern they could anticipate. What they need more than anything is to know what happens next. Pierce thought about that. It was not just about the dog. The recognition document, he said. How does it feel? She was quiet for a moment. Complicated, she said. I spent a lot of years not expecting it. You stop expecting something long enough, you restructure around the absence. She looked at her hands. It's good. It is. I need to figure out what it means for what comes next. What I do with it. What do you want to do with it? She looked at Dust. The dog's ears moved again. Something real, she said. Something that uses what I know, not undercover, not classified, not in a place that officially doesn't exist. She paused. Rourke mentioned that the protocol we built, the individual behavioral assessment approach, there's no standardized training for it in the military working dog retirement system. No formal curriculum. I know, Pierce said. I've been saying that for 2 years. Who would build it? Someone who understood both the medical and the behavioral side. Someone who'd worked with K9 units in the field and understood what those dogs carry when they come back. Evelyn looked at him. "Is that an offer?" she said. "It's an observation," he said, "that I have a formal request going to Voss's office for a program development consultant position, and that the position description is specific enough that it reduces the eligible candidate pool to approximately one person." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face. Not the managed neutral, not the careful distance, but the real version of her, the one that had been showing up in fragments all week, the one that existed under all the years of operating without expecting to be seen. "You wrote the description around me," she said. "I wrote it accurately," he said. She shook her head slowly, but she was almost smiling, and this time she let it be visible. "I'll think about it," she said. "I know you will," he said. They sat in the kennel, the two of them, and Dust, in the specific quiet that comes after things have been decided, even when they haven't been said officially. And the mountains outside were dark and cold, and the light above the kennels was steady and warm, and the old dog beside Evelyn breathed the long, slow breath of an animal who had found, after a long time of looking, something resembling peace. She left Thursday morning. She didn't make an announcement. She didn't call a meeting. She came to Block 7 at 0630 before the handlers arrived, and she went to each kennel in sequence: Vega, Reaper, Six-Pack, May, Kodiak's empty kennel where she stood for a moment, and Dust last. Wills was there, arriving early in the way young people who care about something arrive early, with coffee she hadn't drunk yet and a face that was trying to be professional. "Same time, same approach," Evelyn said to her. "Every day. Don't adjust the schedule even when he seems better, especially when he seems better." "I know," Will said. "He's going to test it. He's going to have bad days, and you're going to wonder if you're doing it wrong. You're not." Evelyn looked at her. "You're just doing it slowly, which is the only way it works." Wills nodded. Her jaw was set in the way it got when she was managing something. "You're good at this," Evelyn said. Not encouragement, assessment. The difference was in the tone, and Wills heard it. "I'm learning," Will said. "Same thing," Evelyn said. Dust was at the fence when she got to his kennel. He'd been at the fence most mornings lately, which Rourke had noted in the behavioral log as significant, and which Pierce had noted in his own way, which was to say nothing about it and simply observe. Evelyn put her hand to the chain link, and he pressed his nose against her knuckles the way he'd been doing, and she stood there for a minute, just that. Then she shouldered her canvas bag and picked up the hard-sided case that she'd packed the night before, and she walked down the corridor toward the exit. Pierce was at the facility door. She'd known he would be. "Thursday," he said. 3 weeks. "Approximately," she said. "Approximately is fine." She stopped. She looked at him with that direct reading look she had, the one that didn't perform anything. "Pierce," she said, "what you did, calling Voss, building the package, standing in that conference room when you didn't have to. The dogs needed—" "I'm not talking about the dogs," she said. "I mean—" She stopped, restructured, because Evelyn Carter did not say the imprecise version of things if she could find the precise one. "You stayed in the room when it would have been easier not to." Pierce held her gaze. "So did you." She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and went through the door into the cold morning light. He watched her cross the base road, the mountains fully visible now, the sky the deep winter blue that came with cold air and no clouds. She walked the way she'd walked across his kennel floor on Monday morning, that specific quality of pace that he'd never found the right word for, that thing that was neither slow nor fast, but something in between that carried its own authority. At the gate, she turned. She raised one hand. Not a wave exactly, just an acknowledgement, the kind you make when you want to say something and the distance is too great for words. He raised his in return. She went through the gate. The formal findings package from the Regional Review Board was distributed 3 days later. It ran 41 pages. The welfare violations were documented in full, with timeline, with the ignored correspondence attached, with the irregular budget accounting itemized in the auditor's section. The recommendation for Hargrove's formal disciplinary process included a note that the pattern of ignored recommendations constituted willful neglect under the base welfare standard, which was the kind of language that foreclosed most administrative escape routes. Hargrove's legal advisor filed 2 responses over the following week. Both were reviewed by the board. Neither changed the findings. The disciplinary process moved forward at the pace of institutional accountability, which is slower than anyone wants and more permanent than most people expect. The facility maintenance project that Hargrove had cited in the contract termination memo turned out, under full audit, to have been completed on budget with funds that had already been allocated from a separate line item, meaning the reallocation had not been financially necessary. The auditor's final note on this section was 4 words: no legitimate basis identified. General Taft received the findings at 800 on a Tuesday, and by 8:30 had signed the orders reinstating the behavioral health contract at full value plus an operational adjustment to account for the months of gap. He also signed a base-wide welfare protocol update that incorporated, by name, the individual behavioral assessment framework that had been documented in a worn notebook during a morning when one temporary nurse with a canvas bag had walked into a kennel crisis and changed the trajectory of 6 dogs' lives. The protocol was named in the base record. Not after Evelyn, she hadn't been consulted on that and would probably have argued against it, but after the unit the 6 dogs had served in. The citation read, "Developed in partnership with Evelyn Carter, consulting specialist." Finch had put that language in the draft. Pierce had approved it. Neither of them had asked her permission, which she discovered when she came back in week 3 and found the framed citation on the wall of the kennel facility entrance. She stood in front of it for a long moment. Pierce stood beside her, not saying anything. "You could have asked me," she said. "I could have," he agreed. She looked at the citation, at her name in the official language of a military base record, in a place where it could not be sealed and could not be redacted, and was not going anywhere. "Carter," Pierce said, "the program development consultant position. Voss approved it this morning." She looked at him. "Official, fully credentialed. You'd be based here initially, travel for site assessments across the district. Building the curriculum, training handlers in the assessment approach, working with the retirement facilities on behavioral protocol." He paused. "It's real work. Visible, documented. Your name on everything." She looked back at the citation on the wall. "Your name on everything," he said again, quieter. "No more sealed files. No more operating in spaces that officially don't exist. What you know, on record. Where it can do something." She was quiet for a long moment. The kennel block was busy around them. Rourke with Reaper at the far end, Wills running the morning protocol with Dust, the sounds of handlers and animals finding their rhythms in the new routine. Kodiak was in his kennel by the exterior wall, lying in a patch of sunlight from the high window, not doing much, which Finch had said was exactly what an aging Malinois with managed cardiac disease should be doing. "I'm not a dog trainer," Evelyn said. "No," Pierce said. "You're something considerably more specific than that, and the position description reflects it. I'm going to have opinions about how things are done. I'm aware of that. I'm going to push back when I think something is wrong. I would be concerned if you didn't," he said. "Carter, you've been the most qualified person in every room you've walked into this week, and you've been managing that carefully your whole career. Stop managing it." She looked at him. "You don't have to be invisible anymore," he said. "The work is good. Let it be visible." The kennel was warm and busy, and Dust was at his gate watching Wills with the alert, focused attention of a dog who has started to expect something from the day rather than bracing against it. Six-Pack was in the training yard with a handler Pierce had assigned carefully, following commands with the precision of an animal who had not forgotten what he'd been taught, only mislaid it temporarily. May, the quietest of the 6, the one whose distress had been the least dramatic and therefore the most overlooked, had started vocalizing again the previous morning in the low social register that working dogs use when they feel safe enough to announce themselves. Evelyn watched all of it. "Okay," she said. Pierce nodded. "I'm going to need an office," she said. "A real one, not a closet with a desk." "Already requested. And I want weekly access to all 6 dogs for the first 3 months, separate from the handler rotations." "Done. And if the training curriculum gets implemented district-wide, I want handler feedback incorporated into every revision cycle. Not just the officer's assessment, the handlers. Write that into the program structure and I'll back it. She looked at him. At the citation on the wall? At the kennels where 6 dogs who had been written off were instead, slowly, imperfectly, on their own timelines, becoming themselves again. The greatest thing you can do for someone who's been broken, she said, not quite to him, looking at Dust pressed against his gate with his ears forward and his body still, isn't to fix them. It's to stay long enough that they fix themselves. She paused. I spent years learning that from dogs. I should have applied it earlier to people. Pierce didn't say anything because there was nothing to add to that. She picked up the pen from the sign-in clipboard on the wall beside the citation and signed her name under the consultant access register, and it was the most ordinary gesture in the world. A name on a daily log, the kind of thing done hundreds of times in hundreds of facilities by hundreds of people who think nothing of it. But Evelyn Carter held the pen for a second after she signed it, and Pierce, watching, understood why. It was her real name, on a real document, in a real place. No codes, no classifications, no erasure waiting on the other side. Just her name, in a facility where the work she'd done was written on the wall and the dogs she'd reached were alive in the kennels, and the record of what she'd given, 15 years of it, no longer sealed, no longer invisible, was finally, completely, and irrevocably in the right place. She put the pen back on the clipboard. Same time tomorrow? She said. Same time tomorrow, Pierce said. And there is something worth sitting with in that, the smallness of it, the ordinariness. Not a ceremony, not a speech, not the triumphant moment that the story might seem to be building toward. Just a woman who had spent 15 years doing necessary work in invisible places, finally standing in a lit room, in a building where her name was on the wall, saying yes to the next morning. The world doesn't often produce the dramatic vindication. The music doesn't always swell at the right moment. The people who deserved recognition decades ago don't always get it in time for it to feel clean. But sometimes, not always, not neatly, not without the mess and cost and imperfect hours that preceded it, sometimes the work gets seen. Sometimes the record gets corrected. Sometimes the person who is written off is just another civilian, just a temporary hire, just somebody's inconvenient opinion. Sometimes that person gets to put their name on the wall and have it mean something. Evelyn Carter walked back into the kennel to start her first official day's work, and Dust came to the gate before she reached it, and the morning was cold and clear, and the mountains were exactly where they'd always been, and nothing about any of it was perfect, and all of it was enough.